wasn't playing football and they wasn't playing hockey or soccer for Diddy to come on stage, pat him on his ass, and then make the statement to people in the world that can't nobody call me Sean but Jay-Z. Now, I don't know what kind of statement, and I can't say, I wish I could say half a homo, but I know I can't say it, but I don't know what kind of half a homo that is. And you trying to say that you're not close to somebody. You coming on stage, patting them on their ass, and then you making a broad statement to the public, can't nobody call me Sean but Sean Carter. And I heard Jay-Z said the same thing about them. But they were so close that they had matching white girls.
If you finished the documentary and felt like something important was missing, you're not imagining it. Because according to widespread online speculation, there was footage Netflix never wanted you to see. Not a rumor added after the fact. Not a fan theory stitched together on social media. But an entire segment that, allegedly, made executives nervous enough to cut it at the last moment. What makes this different is who tried to keep it in. For months, Cat Williams has been saying the same thing in different ways. Not that the truth wouldn't come out, but that it would come out selectively. That certain stories would be told, while others would quietly disappear before the audience even knew they existed. At the time, people laughed it off as comedy. Now, with reaction channels replaying old interviews and insiders speaking more freely, that warning is starting to sound less like a joke and more like a blueprint.
How does Jay-Z sit down with Gayle King and she not ask him one question about the intersection between him and Aaliyah and Robert Kelly? This is insane that people keep refusing to see what's right there.
According to claims circulating online, 50 Cent pushed hard to include a segment involving Jay-Z. Not accusations. Not conclusions. Just footage, context, and questions. And that alone, people believe, was enough to trigger resistance. Because once that door opens, it doesn't just change one episode. It changes the entire narrative. Clips have vanished. Posts have been edited. Conversations have suddenly stopped mid-sentence. And every time someone asks why, the answer is always the same: legal reasons, creative decisions, timing. But viewers aren't buying it anymore. So here's the question you have to ask yourself. If this footage was harmless, why fight so hard to keep it out? And if it wasn't important, why did it allegedly cause so much panic behind the scenes?
Rihanna was trafficked to Def Jam.
She was an innocent baby when she came over here. And look
She
at
was
her now.
14 going on 15 years old, flown over without parental supervision in a private plane by a man who was supposed to be a producer who auditioned her at 3 a.m. in the f***ing morning in a hotel room, auditioning at 3 a.m. in the morning, a 14-year-old girl.
With no parental consent.
With
She
no
just
parental, nobody. She
Well,
was
yeah.
flown. She was flown to another country. She was taken to Def Jam headquarters. She was left in a conference room alone with Sean Carter for nearly 6 hours alone, with no parental supervision.
Because once we break down what people believe was removed, and why, it starts to look less like editing, and more like protection. When people talk about what was cut, they usually imagine something explosive. A single clip. A shocking quote. One moment that went too far. But according to online speculation, what Netflix removed wasn't a moment at all. It was a direction. A path the documentary briefly started down, then suddenly backed away from. That matters, because documentaries don't just show footage. They make choices about where the story is allowed to go. According to people familiar with the production chatter, the footage involving Jay-Z wasn't framed as an accusation. It wasn't a gotcha moment. It was contextual. Background. A series of connections, timelines, and questions that, when placed together, shifted the tone of the entire episode. And that shift, allegedly, made executives uncomfortable. The reason starts with proximity. For decades, Jay-Z has existed in the same orbit as many of the most powerful figures in music, business, and media. That's not controversial. That's public record. Award shows, partnerships, labels, joint appearances.
There was no way I could stay.
Oh my God.
And then I started doing my research and I started talking to other victims. I should have never signed that non-disclosure agreement, but I did. I took the blood oath and so did my first husband.
Whoa.
And I left.
That's why it ain't never been right since. Because you left it. You don't leave anything like that.
I did. And he was paid to be my husband so no one would know who I was really involved.
The issue, according to reaction culture, isn't whether those relationships existed. It's how rarely they're examined when controversies surface around people in the same circle. When the documentary focused on one central figure, the story stayed clean. Linear. Easy to digest. Rise, excess, downfall. But once it began acknowledging overlapping networks, the narrative became messier. Suddenly, the question wasn't just about individual behavior. It became about ecosystems. And ecosystems are harder to contain. One reaction creator put it this way: they didn't want viewers asking why certain people are always nearby, but never accountable. That idea spread quickly. According to claims shared online, the cut segment included archived footage, old interviews, and industry commentary that highlighted how tightly connected certain power players were during key moments in music history. Not wrongdoing. Not crimes. Just presence. And presence, when repeated enough, becomes uncomfortable. Because it invites questions.
Last question. I asked you
Why was this person always in the room?
Do it even more, go detail. What do you predict will happen next in the future? You know, it's like you see it before it happens.
Kathy White's true killer is going to be unveiled, and it's not a man. And that woman died screaming.
Anything else?
Yeah, show him the tape, Diddy. You got it.
Oh man,
That might buy you a little time. You should probably stop looking for plastic surgeons.
man.
Looking for a new life, new face. We gonna hang you high. Jay-Z too, Beyonce too, and we gonna round up all the See, I love a good gay man. I just can't stand him. And that's what it is.
Would that be?
You want to know what's going to happen next?
Yeah.
Why do the same names keep appearing whenever big deals happen? And why do conversations change when those names come up? None of those questions accuse anyone of anything. But they do something arguably more dangerous. They encourage independent thinking. That's where the pushback allegedly began. Insiders have suggested that once early cuts were reviewed, concerns were raised about scope creep. That's the industry term for when a project starts to expand beyond its original mandate. In this case, what began as a focused documentary risked becoming a broader examination of power dynamics in entertainment. And according to people who've worked on similar projects, that's usually where resistance shows up. Not because something is false, but because it's too big. Online forums started comparing this to past documentaries that were quietly shelved or heavily edited. Viewers noticed patterns. Segments teased in trailers that never appeared. Quotes referenced in early press that didn't make the final cut. It created the impression that something had been reshaped late in the process. And reshaping leaves fingerprints. One of the most discussed fingerprints was timing. According to people tracking production timelines, edits continued unusually late. Final approvals came closer to release than normal. And that, in the documentary world, often means negotiations happened behind closed doors. Negotiations don't always involve demands. Sometimes they involve concerns. Legal exposure. Brand safety. Platform risk. Questions like, if this airs, what doors close? Those aren't moral questions. They're business questions. Which brings us back to 50 Cent. Love him or hate him, his reputation isn't subtle. He's known for pushing boundaries, challenging narratives, and leaning into controversy. That's part of his brand. So when multiple sources claimed he resisted cutting the segment, people believed it. It fit his pattern. But even people like him have limits. According to speculation, the disagreement wasn't about whether the footage was accurate. It was about whether the platform was willing to carry the weight of what that footage implied. Because implication is powerful. It doesn't accuse. It suggests. And suggestion invites scrutiny. Reaction culture immediately understood this. Comment sections filled with variations of the same thought. They didn't want the audience connecting dots on their own. That's an important point. Audiences today don't need conclusions handed to them. They just need enough context to start asking questions. And once that happens, control over the narrative slips away. You can't issue a statement to millions of independent thinkers. You can't retract curiosity. So according to claims, the safest option was to remove the entire direction altogether. The internet, of course, did the opposite. Once people realized a segment might have been cut, attention intensified. Old interviews resurfaced. Clips from award shows were replayed. Statements once considered harmless were re-examined under a different lens. Not as evidence, but as patterns. And patterns are sticky. One viral post summed it up without naming anyone. When a documentary avoids a subject this carefully, it's usually because the subject is bigger than the film. That post didn't last long. Screenshots circulated of content being taken down. Creators claimed certain videos were demonetized faster than usual. Others said their uploads were flagged even when they used cautious language. Whether that was coincidence or heightened sensitivity is unclear. But the perception of pressure alone was enough to fuel speculation. And perception is everything online. This is where Cat Williams' earlier comments re-entered the conversation. Not specific statements. Broad ones. About how truth in entertainment is managed. About how exposure is often selective. About how some stories stop not because they're wrong, but because they're inconvenient. Those clips started circulating again, reframed not as comedy, but as commentary. People began to ask whether the documentary showed what it could, not what it should. Whether compromise was the price of access. And whether cutting the Jay-Z-related footage was less about protecting an individual and more about protecting the architecture of the industry itself. Because if you acknowledge how power clusters, you have to explain why. And once you explain why, the story no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the audience. That's the part platforms fear the most. And it sets up what comes next, because the footage itself is only half the story. The more revealing part, according to many viewers, is who benefits when that footage disappears. That's where the conversation shifts from editing choices to power structures. Or Yahen Say Story or Gary Ho Jadi Hai. What made the situation escalate wasn't just that footage was removed. It was how the removal appeared to happen. According to people who closely follow documentary production cycles, late-stage cuts are rare unless something changes the risk profile of a project. Budgets are locked. Timelines are set. Once a cut reaches internal review, major deletions usually mean pressure entered the room. Online speculation suggests this pressure didn't come in the form of a single demand. It came as a series of concerns. Legal exposure. Business relationships. Platform responsibility. Questions that don't sound dramatic on paper, but completely reshape decisions behind closed doors. Because when a documentary references someone with deep institutional ties, it's no longer just storytelling. It becomes liability management. Reaction culture noticed this immediately. Viewers didn't just talk about what was missing, they talked about how quiet everyone became afterward. No follow-up interviews addressing the omission. No behind-the-scenes explanations. No creative choice statements. Just silence. And in the entertainment industry, silence is rarely accidental. According to several creators who analyze media patterns, this silence fits a familiar template. First, a project pushes toward uncomfortable territory. Then, that territory disappears. Finally, the conversation is redirected to safer ground. The audience is expected to move on. But this time, they didn't. Part of the reason is timing. Public trust in curated narratives is at an all-time low. People are used to seeing clips vanish, posts edited, and stories reframed after the fact. So when viewers sensed something had been removed, they didn't wait for confirmation. They started looking for context on their own. Old interviews resurfaced. Not because they proved anything, but because they showed proximity. Familiar faces appearing together at key moments. Statements that once seemed casual now sounding carefully worded. Again, no accusations, just patterns. And patterns create discomfort. According to online discussion, one reason the Jay-Z-related material was especially sensitive is because it risked shifting the documentary's center of gravity. The story was supposed to be about one man's excesses and downfall. Introducing broader networks would have reframed it as a story about how power circulates and protects itself. That's a much harder sell, not just legally, but culturally. Because once you frame a system, you implicate everyone who benefits from it. People believe that's why the footage didn't just get trimmed, it was removed entirely. Partial inclusion would have raised more questions than it answered. A few seconds of context can be more destabilizing than an hour of allegations. It invites viewers to connect dots independently. An independent interpretation is unpredictable. That unpredictability is what platforms fear. Not backlash, but loss of control. Once audiences start forming their own narratives, official messaging stops working. Statements sound hollow. Clarifications feel reactive. Silence becomes suspicious. Reaction videos captured this shift in real time. Early uploads focused on what the documentary showed. Later ones focused on what it avoided. Comment sections changed tone. Less outrage, more analysis. Less shock, more skepticism. One comment that gained traction read, "They didn't cut the footage to protect the truth. They cut it to protect the frame." That idea spread because it resonated. The frame determines how a story is understood. Who is centered? Who is peripheral? Who is invisible? By removing the Jay-Z-related context, the documentary maintained a narrow frame. It kept the focus on a single narrative arc instead of allowing the audience to zoom out. Zooming out is dangerous. Because once you do, you start asking systemic questions. Why do certain figures always remain adjacent to controversy but never inside it? Why do some names trigger immediate caution while others don't? Why does accountability feel selective? According to speculation, these are the questions the cut footage risked encouraging. This is also where the idea of the untouchable figure begins to emerge, not as a villain, but as a concept. Someone so embedded in institutional structures that addressing them directly destabilizes the entire ecosystem. Not because they're guilty of anything specific, but because they sit at the intersection of too many interests. Labels. Platforms. Partnerships. Investments. Touching that intersection means touching everything connected to it. That's why many believe the decision wasn't about Jay-Z as an individual. It was about precedent. If one highly connected figure becomes a subject of contextual scrutiny, others inevitably follow. The story doesn't stop where you want it to. It keeps expanding. And expansion is the enemy of containment. This theory gained traction when creators began pointing out how quickly related content was deprioritized. Videos didn't disappear entirely, but they stopped being recommended. Threads didn't get deleted, but they stopped trending. It wasn't suppression in the dramatic sense. It was quiet deprioritization. Enough to cool the conversation without igniting backlash. That's how modern gatekeeping works. Not with bans. With friction. Add enough friction, and most people move on. But not everyone. Some viewers stayed focused on the absence itself. On the fact that no one addressed it directly. On how quickly the conversation was redirected. For them, the missing footage became more important than any clip that aired. Because absence implies intent. And intent implies power. By the end of this phase of the discussion, the narrative had shifted completely. This was no longer about what 50 Cent wanted to include or what Netflix chose to cut. It was about what happens when storytelling runs up against structures designed to remain unseen. Which raises the final question. If this much resistance surfaced over contextual footage, what would happen if something more concrete ever emerged? That's where the story stops being retrospective and starts pointing forward. By the time the conversation reached this point, the focus had quietly shifted again. It was no longer about whether footage existed, or who argued to keep it in. It became about what happens after a story hits its limit. Because in cases like this, the most revealing phase is never the release. It's the aftermath. According to people tracking the fallout, the signs were subtle but consistent. Interviews that might have addressed the missing segment never happened. Questions that would normally come up in press rounds were avoided entirely. Even phrasing changed. Words like cut, removed, or banned were replaced with softer language, creative direction, final edits, story focus. Not explanations. Reframes. Silence did most of the work. Creators noticed that the people closest to the project stopped engaging publicly. No clarifications. No defensive statements. Just distance. And distance, in media, usually signals that legal teams have entered the room. Not necessarily because anyone did something wrong, but because risk has been identified. Risk doesn't need proof. It just needs potential. That's where the idea of the untouchable figure fully settles in. Not as a single person, but as a position within the system. Someone whose name isn't dangerous because of what it proves, but because of what it connects. When you examine that position, you're no longer questioning individuals. You're questioning the architecture of influence itself. And architecture doesn't respond well to scrutiny. According to industry observers, this is how protection systems operate. They don't deny. They don't argue. They reduce visibility. Conversations slow down. Algorithms cool off. Interest is gently redirected elsewhere. Nothing dramatic enough to cause backlash. Just enough to restore equilibrium. That's why the disappearing clips mattered. Not because they were definitive, but because they suggested sensitivity. The same content, posted weeks earlier, would have been ignored. Now it was being quietly deprioritized. Not removed, but buried. Burial is cleaner than censorship. Reaction culture interpreted this as confirmation not of guilt, but of boundaries. As one widely shared comment put it, you can tell where the fence is by who refuses to step near it. That line stuck because it captured the feeling many had: the story didn't end naturally. It was contained. And containment always leaves residue. Some believe more material exists. Not explosive footage, not incriminating evidence, but context. Interviews that complicate the narrative. Timelines that don't align perfectly. Moments that, when placed together, make the official story feel incomplete. None of it conclusive. All of it uncomfortable. Others think the real issue isn't what was filmed, but what wasn't allowed to be filmed at all. Topics flagged early. Angles discouraged. Questions advised against. That kind of influence never shows up in credits, but it shapes everything. This is where the story turns forward. Because if a documentary can reach this many people while still avoiding certain paths, it raises a larger question about future projects. What stories are being pitched right now that will never make it past development? What investigations stall before cameras even roll? And how many creators self-edit because they already know where the lines are? That's the long-term effect of moments like this. Not outrage. Not scandal. But restraint. Cat Williams' earlier warnings echo again here, not as prophecy, but as pattern recognition. He wasn't talking about one documentary or one figure. He was talking about how truth moves through entertainment. How it advances until it reaches resistance. And how, once it does, it's reshaped into something safer. The missing footage becomes symbolic. Not proof of anything specific, but proof that limits exist. And limits invite curiosity. Because when audiences sense there's more beneath the surface, they don't forget. They wait. They revisit. They connect dots later, when new information emerges from somewhere unexpected. That's why this doesn't feel finished. It feels paused. Paused until another interview surfaces. Until another clip escapes containment. Until someone, no longer protected by proximity or relevance, decides there's nothing left to lose. Those moments don't arrive on schedule. They arrive when pressure shifts. So the real question isn't whether Netflix refused to air certain footage. It's whether refusing to air it actually delayed the conversation or intensified it. Because once people start noticing what's missing, they rarely stop looking. And if this story has taught the audience anything, it's this: the most important parts are almost never the ones you're shown first. Before you scroll away, take a second and think about what you didn't see. Missing footage doesn't disappear without a reason, and silence usually means the conversation touched a nerve. Now it's your turn. Do you think Netflix made a business decision or a protective one? Was cutting that segment responsible storytelling or controlled restraint? Drop your thoughts in the comments and read what others are saying. And if you want to stay ahead of the next reveal, the next disappearance, or the next story that suddenly goes quiet, make sure you're subscribed. This conversation isn't over, it's just waiting for the next crack.